So is Anselm's argument junk, or is this a convincing proof of the existence of God? Well, it's not obvious. And as we've noted, philosophers have disagreed quite a bit about this, so let's take a look at some objections in detail. I'll tell you in advance, I think a lot of these objections are inconclusive, although I think the last one works. Maybe you'll disagree, maybe you think some of these other ones work as well. First objection we'll consider is by a person named Gaunilo. Pretty much all we know about Gaunilo is that he was a monk living during Anselm's time, and that he wrote an answer to Anselm's argument in the Proslogion. And it was a little letter or pamphlet called On Behalf of the Fool, or In Defense of the Fool. And we call this the greatest conceivable island objection, because Gaunilo's point seems to be this. It's not terribly clear, but his point seems to be that this argument is invalid. Premise 1, I have an idea of a greatest conceivable island. Premise, conclusion, therefore, there actually is a greatest conceivable island. Now, nobody thinks that B follows from A, right? Everybody would agree that this argument is invalid. Even if the premise is true, it doesn't follow that the conclusion is true. His point is that Anselm's argument has the same structure as the one above. It moves from an idea to something really existing, and so if the above argument is invalid, then Anselm's argument must also be invalid. Now the problem I think with this is it's not clear that Anselm's argument does have the same structure as the above one. Consider this. Do you really have a coherent idea of a greatest conceivable island? So what would be a great island? Well, it would have beautiful flora and fauna. It would have great weather, maybe lots of nice surfing beaches, surrounded by a clean ocean, maybe some beautiful mountains and jungles, maybe dancing hula girls. What makes an island great? Well, whatever makes an island great, you could always imagine just a little bit more of it. So it's not clear we do have a coherent concept of a greatest conceivable island, an island than which none greater can be thought. Because again, any great island that you can think of a way that would be just a little bit better than it was. Imagine that you had a friend who was really bad at math, and he said that, hey, today in math class, we discovered the highest conceivable integer. You know, a number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He said, yeah, we found the highest one anybody can imagine. No, look, this guy is confused. There isn't any highest conceivable integer. For any one that you imagine, say 1,000,004, well, you can imagine one that's a little bit higher, right? Oh, and you can imagine one that's a little higher than that. There isn't any highest conceivable integer. And don't say infinity, that's not an integer, okay? So it's not clear that the argument really is parallel to this. If you take the concept of the greatest conceivable being, it's not obviously incoherent. So my reply to this is it's not clear that Anselm's argument has the same structure as this one. Another objection was given by Immanuel Kant in his book, The Critique of Pure Reason. The objection is that existence is not a property. And because existence is not a property, it cannot be a great-making property. So the point would be that premise 2 in the argument is false. The premise which says it's greater for a thing to exist in mind and in reality than only in someone's mind. Kant's example is in terms of money. A real $1 million has all the same properties as an imaginary $1 million. The only difference is the one exists and the other one doesn't. Now, the main thing I think one should say about this argument is, why should we believe this, that existence is not a property? Why should we agree that a real $1 million has all the same properties as an imaginary $1 million? One could object, no, the real one has this property, being real, and the other one doesn't. So I'm not really sure that this objection gets us anywhere. It assumes a controversial claim. It's not a claim that all people will agree on. We'd like a stronger objection than this if we could find it. Now, maybe what we should really worry about is the idea that the argument defines something into existence. And you might say, look, you just can't define something into existence. Suppose we said, well, we don't believe in mermaids, but there's something that's an awful lot like a mermaid, which is a super mermaid. And we define a super mermaid as a being which is a mermaid, you know, half woman, half fish. But it also has existence. So that's what a super mermaid is. It's a mermaid which has the property of existence. Now, it doesn't follow that there actually are any super mermaids. If that's what we mean by super mermaid, it only follows that for anything, if it is a super mermaid, then it exists. Right. Anything that matched this concept of being a mermaid plus existing, anything like that would have to exist, sure, if there were something like that. So the idea is it's never legitimate to define something into existence like this. Thus, the argument is invalid. It only follows that if there were a greatest conceivable being, it would exist. So, of course, it makes no sense to say that a point is invalid. Let's correct that. Stupid baby. Okay, but isn't this a devastating objection? Aren't we just defining something into existence? Isn't that a ridiculous procedure to define something into existence? I actually don't think that this is a devastating objection at all. So I'm going to argue that this objection is irrelevant. How so? Well, define into existence is where you take a certain concept, like, I don't know, Cyclops, and then you add existence to it. All right, and you come up with a concept like existing Cyclops. Of course, whatever is an existing Cyclops would also have to be a Cyclops. Right. You can't tell just by examining this concept that there is some giant running around with one eye. Right? That's no way to prove the existence of anything. That's right. But it's not clear that this is what Anselm has done. He hasn't taken some concept which applies to which may or may not apply to anything, and then just added existence onto that concept, and then triumphantly declared that there really is such a thing. Rather, he's taken a concept, greatest conceivable being, right, he hasn't done that and then, said, well, now here's another concept, an existing greatest conceivable being. No, that's not what he did. He didn't take a concept that applies, that may or may not apply to anything in reality, and then paste on the concept of existence to it, and then declare victory. He didn't do that at all. He said, I have this concept of a greatest conceivable being, a being than which nothing greater can be thought. And by the way, I also think that existence is a great making property. It's greater to exist in reality than to exist in the mind alone. So, look, it should also worry us if you look back at Anselm's argument. It's not terribly clear, if the argument is invalid, which premise would be, which step the argument would fail at. Where does the argument go off the rails? It's not clear to me that it is invalid. We'd have to be able to divide the argument in two and say the first top part could all be true, and yet what is below would not have to be true. That's how we show it's invalid. It's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. Okay, so I'm not a big fan of those objections. Here's another one, and students often come up with this, I find. Is it really better to exist in reality in all cases? So we might think it's better if Santa exists in both mind and reality than in mind alone. Right? If Santa exists in mind alone, then he can't bring you presents. He can't see that you've been good all year long and then reward you for it. Or consider Batman. If Batman exists in mind alone, then he can't fight crime. He can't protect the weak and helpless. He can't ensure justice. You might say, look, that's all well and good for Santa or Batman. It'd be better for one of them to exist in reality. But what about, say, a supervillain like the Joker here? The Joker existing merely in mind is better than the Joker existing in reality, isn't it? Joker merely in the mind is only a scary thought. Joker existing in mind and in reality means there's a supervillain running around that's going to steal and kill, right? That would be bad, not good. It's not always better to exist in reality. I don't think this is a good objection. I'll tell you why. Better is not to be understood in a subjective sense. Now you're right, it's better in the sense of being more in line with our interests, that the supervillain was only imaginary. That's right. Anselm is assuming, however, and I actually think this is defensible myself, that not all value is subjective. Subjective value means basically that there's some conscious being that wants it. That's one kind of goodness, right? One thing could be good for you, in other words, you want it, and also bad for me, that is, I don't want it. So we'd say it's valuable relative to you, but not valuable relative to me. Anselm, though, is assuming that there is such a thing as objective greatness. Let me put it this way. Suppose that atheism is true. Pretend that there's no God, there's no other supernatural beings. And suppose that you just left everything else in the world as it was. Well, you'd still have a world full of amazing, intricate plants, canyons, mountains, oceans, let's just say, but no conscious beings. This would still have value, right? A planet with amazing variety of life would still be greater than a planet like totally devoid of life, just with a boring surface full of rocks, like, say, the moon. So if there's an objective idea of greatness, then the kind of greatness we're talking about isn't relative to people's interests or desires. It's just some things are objectively greater than others. So you're objectively greater than a pebble, and you'd be greater than you are now if you had great making features like being all-knowing or being perfectly good. Right? So you're greater in an objective sense than some creatures, and you can imagine being a lot objectively greater than you are. Maybe you wouldn't like being omniscient, but still you'd be a greater being if you were. That's the idea. So if you're willing to grant Anselm the idea that not all value is subjective, which I am, You're willing to say that it's coherent to suppose there's an objective kind of greatness or goodness. Well, then that's all you need. I mean, and if existence really is a great-making property, then a real joker would be greater than an imaginary joker. Just like a very knowledgeable joker would be greater than an ignorant joker. Of course, we wouldn't want a really knowledgeable joker, but that's besides the point. My objection is that premise 2 is false. It supposes that there are two ways to exist. And this is not correct. So premise 2 says it's greater for a thing to exist in mind and in reality than only in someone's mind. Consider the case of Batman. Batman, we think, only exists in the mind, but wait, no. Batman is a man, right? He's 6'2", he's 210 pounds. He has a utility belt. This thing in your mind isn't a man. It can't walk down the street. It can't drive the Batmobile. It can't fight crime. It's just a thought. So to think of something is not for that thing to exist in your mind. It's just being thought about. So it seems to me obviously false that there are these two ways to exist. Look, if I mention the president right now, say, consider the current president of the United States, that doesn't mean that the guy has now come to exist in several new ways, right? I mean, he always just did exist. It's just that now we're thinking about him. And of course, the interesting thing about thought is you can think about what doesn't exist. And that's kind of mysterious. But I suggest that premise 2 is not true. There aren't two ways for a thing to exist. What exists in the mind alone just doesn't exist at all. It doesn't exist in some kind of inferior way. So my verdict is that the argument is unsound. But that's not all there is to it. It turns out there's another argument in Anselm's book, the Proslogion, and we'll take a look at that in the next segment.